So, okay, so let's imagine we were live. So, welcome, Ambassador Shapiro. Thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. It's a real honor to have somebody of your stature and somebody who I respect so much on the program.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. I find you to be one of the more and most honest people really in politics around, especially people that give their understanding and have an insider's view. It's rare to find somebody who's just so honest and moderate in their views. And it's a real pleasure to know you, to have gotten to know you over the last couple of years, and to follow you and to read your things, whether or not people agree or don't agree. Everybody respects your approach to things and how you give credit where credit is due and criticize where criticism is due. So it's a real pleasure to have you.
Well, very kind of you. Very kind of you, Uri, and it's mutual. You and I have had some excellent exchanges. There's we agree about, there are things we disagree about, but the exchanges have never been anything but respectful. And I learn from all people. I agree with the people I disagree with, and so this is a good opportunity to continue our conversation, perhaps with some others listening in.
Great. Okay. Good. So tell us. I know you were. I mean, everybody can look up your information on Google nowadays. So the basic bio is okay, but I'd love to hear from you how you view your life to this point in terms of your background, in terms of your past roles, and currently what you're involved in.
Sure. Of course, what I'm probably best known for is having been U.S. Ambassador to Israel. When I got to that job, which was not a job I'd ever seriously envisioned myself in, I realized only then, and I did say publicly, that it was in a way a job I'd been preparing for my whole life. I had spent time in Israel as a young kid with my parents and my family, which happened to be during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And it was a really foundational bonding experience between us and Israel, and taught me a lot as I got older about the role that the United States played in helping Israel come through that war. Then I later returned to Israel for studies in high school and college. I later went on to become a Middle East politics major and specialist in Washington on Capitol Hill and in the Clinton administration, and later in the Obama administration. And all through those years, the things that really motivated me were how to help to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, how to make sure that Israel will always be secure and strong and Jewish and democratic, how to help Israel take steps toward peace with its neighbors, including the Palestinians, in a two-state solution. And that was really what motivated me as a public official. It's why really I got into public life. It ended up with me joining in with the Obama campaign early in 2007, and then going to the White House as the National Security Council Middle East Senior Director. And then from there, when the president felt that it would be helpful to have someone who had his personal connection and relationship and could speak for him, and also all those kind of historical touch points with Israel, including speaking Hebrew, he asked me to come to Israel as ambassador. So I did that, and in that, in taking on that role, I did really feel like it was the culmination in some ways at a relatively young age, but sort of the pinnacle of what I would of a public role where I could really make a difference in terms of strengthening U.S.-Israel ties, making a contribution to Israel's security, making a contribution to the search for peace. Did that for 5.5 years until the last day of the Obama administration, and it's still the same set of issues are still the things that motivate me, and I still write about them. I'm at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, where I do my kind of policy research and writing. Hope that I can contribute to that debate from outside of government, and perhaps eventually return to government service. But I've also, we've stayed in Israel mostly for family reasons, because of kids who had things they wanted to do for a bit longer before we get back to Washington. But at the same time, I've discovered so many other avenues for me to contribute to the things that I care about. I consult with Israeli companies who are expanding their presence in the U.S. into the U.S. marketplace. I consult with American companies who are trying to expand their U.S. presence. I consult with universities and NGOs in both countries. I am an advisor to initiatives to strengthen U.S., rather Israel diaspora relations, and initiatives to help Israeli societal challenges like bringing more Haredim and Arabs into the high tech sector, and on the board of a school network. So there's a lot of ways that I've discovered as a private citizen outside of government to still continue to contribute to those same issues that have always motivated me, and which might bring me back to government service at some. To say on it is that when my wife and I were students at Hebrew University 30 years ago, we were like anybody else. We walked around in our jeans and our sandals and our backpacks, and we experienced Israel as normal people. I came back a lot on various visits over the years, but then we came back as the ambassador and family, living in that big house and with security around you. It's a bubble, and it was an amazing, very deeply fulfilling and meaningful experience. But it was very different because you're in a bubble and you can't smell and touch and feel Israeli society in quite the same way as you could, and you're very visible and so forth. So these years that we've stayed here temporarily as private citizens have been very pleasant for us because we've been able to reconnect with Israel as normal people. We do our own grocery shopping. We drive our kids around. We, have to manage a household, and I do get occasional double takes in the grocery store when I'm picking out my tomatoes. Hey, didn't you used to be somebody? But it's actually very pleasant for us to just be living as a normal family in Israel and getting to enjoy that part as well.
That's great. So from what I understand from your comments here, you're saying that you're going to work for the Trump administration because you're looking to go back into government service.
Well, I have to say, in my political community back in the United States and in Washington, most of our friends have said, "Don't come back yet. It's not very pleasant for our tribe. We'll want you back later." I am, as I think it's well known from what I write and what I say, I'm not a fan of President Trump. I think he's done a lot of harm to our country, and I hope that his will be a one-term president. I'll certainly be supporting Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee, and we'll see where that could lead if he wins. But that's the if there's a second Trump administration, I think it's 4 more years for sure without government service for me.
I hear. Okay. So you brought it up, and you recently written an op-ed in favor of Vice President Biden, telling Florida Jews that they should vote for Vice President Biden in the primary against Bernie Sanders, which he won handedly. I don't know if anybody noticed that Vice President Biden won that primary in Florida, because I think for the most part it's everybody's paying attention to other things. But why were you so convinced and why are you so convinced that Vice President Biden would be a better president than President Trump and Senator Sanders?
Well, as I wrote about in this article in the South Florida Sun Sentinel, it's a newspaper that's published in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Vice President Biden is somebody who, first of all, comes to this opportunity. It appears he will be the nominee with tremendous experience. He's had a long career in the U.S. Senate. He's spent 8 years as president, as vice president. He has a real record of achievement on a lot of issues that are important to me. I think important to the country. I think important to many people in the Jewish community. By the way, having nothing to do specifically with Israel and the Jewish community. His advocacy for reproductive rights for women and equal pay, and the fight against domestic violence. His support for common sense restrictions on firearms. He's taken on the NRA more than once and successfully found ways to limit weapons that really have no business being on the streets of our cities, and have unfortunately so often been used to cause great carnage. He's an advocate for expanding the accessibility to healthcare for seniors. He's an advocate for a humane and sensible immigration policy, and the Jewish community almost is to a person connected to immigration in our family's history. So there's a lot of things he stands for and has experience in, and that I think would bring very positive policies to the White House. Beyond that, knowing him as I have for about 20 years, working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and then in the administration, he's an unbelievably decent person. He's, as everybody knows, has experienced a lot of personal tragedy in his life. Lost his first wife and a daughter in a terrible car accident when he was just elected to the Senate as a young man. His son, his 45-year-old son, passed away from cancer about 4 years ago. And he has really learned from those experiences enormous empathy, enormous care. He really brings to his public life that sense that the responsibility of public servants is to make people's lives better and understand what they go through and what challenges they face. So that's all about who he is and what he brings to the table as a politician and as policies that I think are right for our country. But on the issues that are maybe of more deeper connection to the Jewish community, he also has a very long record as an outspoken advocate for the fight against anti-Semitism. In his days on the Foreign Relations Committee, that was mostly outward focused toward Europe, where he really pressured European leaders to call anti-Semitism by its name, far right or from jihadist forces, and to provide protection for the Jewish communities in Europe. More recently, and very sadly, that phenomenon has appeared more in the United States. He has said very openly that one of the things that really motivated him to finally jump into the presidential race was what happened in Charlottesville, where there were people marching through the streets carrying torches, saying Jews will not replace us, a horrible anti-Semitic slogan. And you add to that the shootings and the murders in the synagogues in Pittsburgh and Poway. You add to that the harassment and assaults and murders now in Jersey City and in Crown Heights, New York, of Orthodox Jews. It's really a phenomenon that in my lifetime I never expected to see in the United States. And he's got a plan to deal with that too. He's very outspoken in the need to identify and call out anti-Semitism, again, from whatever source and regardless of the political views of those who express it or act on it. He will restore funding to programs that were put in place by the Obama administration, have been cut back to target domestic extremism. He wants to break the nexus between domestic extremism and the accessibility of weapons of war, such as the ones that were used in at least one of those synagogue shootings. So those are issues where I think his care and commitment to something that's of great importance to the Jewish community, but really to our society as a whole, is very profound. And then on Israel, I've spent a lot of time with him around meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu, around visits to Israel. He visited, I think, 3 times during the Obama administration. I was with him for all of those, around opportunities to meet with other Israeli officials and other Israelis, and to speak frequently to Jewish community audiences about Israel. And it is just palpable, the passion he feels about Israel's legitimacy, its justice, the justice of a Jewish state and the historic homeland of the Jewish people. He's called himself very proudly a Zionist, which is not something all non-Jewish politicians, even supporters of Israel, know or feel to say. He has made huge contributions to Israel's security, which he also sees as a U.S. obligation. That was true when he was in the Senate and true with Iron Dome and the $38 billion MOU and many other initiatives of the Obama administration. He's, as I am, deeply committed to helping Israel achieve peace with its neighbors, knowing those neighbors have deep responsibilities, whether we're talking about Arab states that should be normalizing with Israel even before there's a 2-state solution, certainly the Palestinians and their obligations to end incitement and payments to terrorists and all of those kinds of outrages, but also knowing Israel has responsibilities that include ending settlement expansion that would prevent a 2-state solution from coming into being, certainly not to proceed with annexation, unilateral annexation in the West Bank. So this is something that he views as absolutely fundamental and consistent with his belief that Israel's legitimacy and the need for it to exist both on moral terms and on strategic terms. He sometimes says, if the United States didn't have an Israel in the Middle East, we'd have to invent one for all it does to help us manage our interests with Iran and Syria and terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and instability. So all of that is tied together for him, that Israel must be strong and must be secure, it must be Jewish, it must be democratic, and that's the basis for this moral and strategic bond between our two countries, which I see him as president only acting to strengthen further if given the opportunity.
Okay, and how do you see that as? I mean, I think we could set aside Senator Sanders already. I don't think that's I think he's pretty much bowed out without officially bowing out yet. But if a lot of people would say that President Trump has just been the greatest president for Israel that has been there. How do you see Vice President Biden countering that notion as the election goes on?
Well, look, I mean, there are things President Trump has done for Israel that I can agree to and do. He's continued in many ways the security cooperation and expanded it further in some ways beyond what we did, as we expanded it beyond what the Bush administration before us. The trajectory of U.S.-Israel security cooperation just continues to go up, and that's very much welcome. There are those who are very satisfied that the president moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. I personally said it was the right thing to do and believe the U.S. Embassy belongs in Jerusalem. I think he left out some very important elements of the context of that, of placing it in the context of a two-state solution and the opportunity for two capitals in Jerusalem as well. But in and of itself, that move was not on its own merits. It's in the embassy is in the right place. Then you get to other things that are popular among some Israelis and some friends of Israel, but I disagree with. I think withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, while that's popular in Israel, was a mistake. It doesn't mean the deal was perfect. There probably was no such thing as a perfect deal, and we always knew we would have to come back and find a way to strengthen and extend and add elements to that deal to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. But what I'm concerned about the President Trump's approach has been is that he has acted in a way that has really isolated the United States from most of our allies. It is true that Israel and some of the Gulf states appreciate the Trump administration's approach, but beyond that, when you talk to Europeans, when you talk certainly to the Russians and Chinese, who are partners in the original Iran nuclear deal, we have no support from any of them. We're essentially putting the pressure on Iran. It's real pressure. The sanctions have had a real impact, but we're doing it all by ourselves. And in the meantime, Iran has actually shortened the time to break out to a nuclear weapon from where they stood under the deal. So arguably, we've made this situation more dangerous and have fewer tools, or certainly fewer partners and allies to get the Iranians to really account for their unacceptable behaviors, both in reference to nuclear and regional terror activities. On the Palestinian issue, my concern is that there are a number of steps President Trump has taken that will actually destabilize the situation even before you get to any kind of negotiation, which I don't really think is possible in the near term, given the mistrust between the leaders. But by withdrawing, all funds for any economic support, even healthcare support, even people-to-people support for Palestinians, even the stuff that the Palestinian Authority doesn't control, he has weakened the economic situation of average Palestinians. He has essentially found himself unable to conduct any diplomacy with the Palestinians for the last 2 years. You could say the Palestinians deserve, reparable blame for that as well. After the Jerusalem announcement, they withdrew any contact. But a mediator, if one aspires to be a mediator, does have to talk to both sides. And by closing a consulate that dealt with the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, by closing the PLO office in Washington, there's essentially no contact at all between the United States and Palestinians. So obviously, when he then went forward and put out his plan, it was a plan that had only been discussed with one side, and so naturally it reflected the preferences of one side, the Israeli side. It doesn't reflect any Palestinian preferences. The Palestinians will just not deal with it. It's not a question of whether there will be negotiations on the basis of that plan. There simply won't be. And unfortunately, it also seems to be trying to give a green light. I don't know if this will happen because of the Israeli political tangle, but it seems to be trying to give a green light for Israel to do a very significant annexation unilaterally of about 30% of the West Bank, which really would be the death of the two-state solution. And if the death of the two-state solution is really pronounced, that's the point at which Israel has almost impossible dilemmas about how to remain a Jewish and democratic state. So I worry that President Trump's policies are pushing Israel into a circumstance in which it will be much harder for it to sustain the kind of identity and character and the basis in many ways of what's been the close ties between the United States and Israel. And that could eventually come to harm our security partnership, which would be very much against the U.S. interest. I think it would also be against Israel's interest. But this is what troubles me about President Trump's approach, and I think the Biden approach is far superior.
It's funny because as you're going through the list of reasons, I'm sitting there saying, well, that's why I like President Trump, and that's why I like President Trump, and
Yeah.
So it's definitely different perspective.
I don't have any doubt that I just reinforced your decision to vote for Trump for re-election.
I'm not saying who I'm voting for. I'm just saying that that might not have been the most convincing argument to somebody sitting in the 30% that of Judea and Samaria that might be annexed. Yeah, that was yeah.
But let me ask you a question. But Uri, because we've had some conversation about this, but I think it would be helpful for me to learn and maybe others to learn. Help me understand if let's say that annexation that is proposed in the Trump plan were enacted this year, let's say, and so now 30% of the West Bank, including where you live, is considered sovereign Israeli territory and recognized as such by the United States, probably by no other country, but by the United States. Tell me where you think that leads.
So I see it as not one of these. I think a lot of people look at it as a solution. I don't see that there is a possible solution. I think that we're going to be in a series of steps and status quos for the next 50 years. I think everybody seems to say that, if we don't solve it right now, it's there's going to be, a catastrophic ends. I don't see that really as true. I see that we've been saying that since Oslo, that if we don't get this done right now, and it's been 52 years of everybody, wringing their hands and saying, what are we going to do? I see it as, because it's the 30% and it's so like, again, it's not perfectly carved out, but it's mostly only covers Jewish Israelis. So it's not really going to be, annexing Palestinians. So Palestinians will still have the ability to live freely and, choose the life that they want. So it's not that. So I just see it as taking what would have happened in any administration. In any administration, there would have been land swaps, and just saying, okay, let's just cut to the chase, and giving that land that we all know would become part of Israel anyway, and just allowing that to become part of Israel now. So I don't see it as really, what people are saying, that now all of a sudden it's going to threaten Jews, the Jewish identity of the state or the democratic identity of the state. I don't see that as true. I think it's mostly Jewish-only areas anyway. And therefore, it's not going to really have that much of an effect. I don't think the morning after we wake up after the annexation, there's really going to be that much difference on the ground.
I don't want to prolong it, the exchange, but I'll just ask one follow-up question, which is, I guess what worries me about this scenario. I mean, there are areas that are included in that 30% that have been envisioned as part of an agreed set of land swaps. So an annexation, but that comes with a swap, and that both sides have signed off on. This is different because it's unilateral, but also because it's larger, and it carves up the remainder into kind of disconnected areas that don't make for a really viable state. But let's assume that scenario played out. By the way, I'm also not in the camp of those who think we got to solve it now, because I don't think we can solve it now. I'm more about keeping it alive for eventually coming back to it.
Right, which we talked about. Yeah.
And there are different leaders. But I guess, I guess the question that worries me from the scenario you describe is that I think it is easy to imagine. Nobody can predict this with certainty, but it's easy to imagine that in that circumstance of of the 30% unilateral annexation and the carving up of the Palestinian areas, you would essentially, it would be very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to survive long term. It might survive for a while, it might survive while Abbas is alive, but over time, it would be hard for Palestinian leaders to justify to their own people, or for the people to support the idea of this kind of very, very limited autonomy that's clearly not leading, no longer leading, as Oslo sort of envisioned it would, towards statehood. And if the Palestinian Authority sort of doesn't continue, if it collapses, if it ceases to function, first of all, you lose security cooperation that's very important and beneficial. But second of all, even more than that, you could find that the Israeli authorities, just by necessity, would be sort of pulled back into these Palestinian population centers to provide for basic civil services, food, healthcare, water, education, whatever, as well as needing to deal with security. And then Israel sort of back into a full-on control of those Palestinians' lives. That's, to me, the point at which the question that will be raised quite broadly in the international community, certainly in part of the U.S. population, and I think even in parts of Israel, about is this still a democratic system unless full rights of voting are given to that population that lives under Israeli control. And if it is given those rights, pretty soon you have a roughly equivalent Jewish and Arab population. So that's the scenario that I envision coming out of this.
Right. So I would look at it. I think that a lot of people look at that and they see all the positives of the Palestinian Authority in terms of that it controls a lot of the civil services, and it has great security cooperation with Israel. But I think that a lot of times people don't look at the negatives of the Palestinian Authority and realize how corrupt it is and how bad it is for the Palestinian people. And maybe this creates an opportunity for real leadership to step up, especially Mahmoud Abbas is not a young man. And he's had illnesses, and I mean, no leader is going to last forever. So maybe this creates the opportunity for a new form of Palestinian leadership to step up, and maybe the international community takes a step up and forces their hand to create a truly democratic Palestinian Authority that takes control, that keeps up the security situation with Israel, and recognizes the fact that, look, the mistakes of our previous leaders led us to this situation. We don't want it to get any worse. We've already had 30%, in their minds, 80-something% of their land taken from them. So we don't want it to get any worse. And we recognize if we keep the status quo going, it's just going to get worse. It's not going to get better for us. So maybe this provides the opportunity for the Palestinian people to finally step up and have a better life. Either way, it could totally break down in a scenario that you're presenting. But I'm hoping for a more optimistic hope and change of a new Palestinian Authority.
Yeah. Well, I can stipulate to a lot of the criticisms of the Palestinian Authority in terms of corruption and mismanagement, and certainly not preparing their people for peace and really accepting Israel's legitimacy in the way that it must. But I guess I'm hard pressed to see a more moderate Palestinian leadership arising out of the scenario that you're describing, and I'm not sure any viable, stable Palestinian leadership arises, and then you have, basically Israel back in full control of the lives of those 3 million people.
So this is amazing. You have the former Obama administration official taking a very pessimistic view of the Palestinians, and you have a settler taking a very optimistic view of them. Yeah, so this is we've sort of maneuvered ourselves into corners, which I don't think anybody would assume we would ever find ourselves in. But yeah, that's it could be. We're out of time, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate this, especially these last 10 minutes of examining ideas of what the future can hold, which none of us know, especially in these times. I thank you very, very much for joining us, and unfortunately it didn't work out live, but I'm definitely going to post the recording of this, and people will get to watch it, and hopefully one day we'll be able to look back and say we were both right in certain ways, and a brighter future for everybody.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Thank you always for the respectful and insightful discourse when we agree and when we disagree. So I wish you, everybody listening,
Okay.